Right now, my signature program, Scribble School, is open for enrollment, but not for long. This is the robust program that will take you from knowing nothing or a little bit about hieroglyphs to reading the common text you're going to actually see in museums, online, and on trips to Egypt. And there's a very special bonus available right now for the first 25 people who sign up by Friday, May 15th. They'll get the special bonus Hieroglyph a Day planner. This planner is not available anywhere else. It's not sold separately. This is the only way to get it. So you'll want to check out all the details and grab your spot in Scribble School at scribbleschool.com. Welcome to Voices of Ancient Egypt, the podcast for people who don't just want to learn about ancient Egypt, but want to understand it on a deeper, more meaningful level. I'm Melinda Nelson-Hurst, an Egyptologist with a Ph.D. in the field and years of experience teaching at the university level, working in Egypt, and training students around the world to read real ancient Egyptian texts. I've spent decades studying this civilization in a traditional academic setting so you don't have to, and so you can access knowledge that's usually locked behind academic walls. This podcast brings ancient Egyptian history, beliefs, and language to life, and shows you that learning hieroglyphs is possible, no matter your age, background, or schedule. So whether you want to read hieroglyphs in museums, on social media, or on your next trip to Egypt, you'll find the tools, stories, and encouragement to make it real right here. Let's hear the voices of the ancient world together. Hello, and welcome to the Voices of Ancient Egypt podcast. I'm your host, Melinda Nelson-Hurst. And in this episode, I'm excited to share with you a bit about me, who I am, why do I run this podcast, how did I get here? And first of all, since I'm running a podcast about ancient Egypt, you might have guessed that I'm an Egyptologist. I have a Ph.D. in the field. I teach at a university, and also I run Voices of Ancient Egypt, which you can find on many other platforms, including YouTube and on social media, and run a couple of different programs for people who love ancient Egypt and who want to learn hieroglyphs. And we'll talk a bit more about those in another episode. But as some people might wonder, where did I come from? How did I get here, right? Well, like I hear from so many of you, and I've heard from so many of my students, that there was often one specific trip or visit to a museum or a book you ran across or maybe a movie you saw that really sparked your love for ancient Egypt. And that was absolutely the case for me as well. I'd love to hear what yours was, by the way. If you want to reply to an email from me or send me a DM on Instagram, I'd love to hear what it was that sparked your interest. For me, actually, I fell in love with ancient Egypt probably before I can even remember. My mother tells me I was drawn to the material the very first time she brought me to a museum. But as far as when I remember, the first time I really remember just being completely in love and enamored with ancient Egypt is when I saw the traveling exhibition called Ramses the Great. When it came to Boston, I grew up in the Boston area, so I was very fortunate to be somewhat close to the Museum of Fine Arts there. I didn't live in the city, but close enough that we could go sometimes. And in this case, actually, this traveling exhibition came to a different museum in the area, the Science Museum. And I still remember it really well. This was my first really strong memories to do with ancient Egypt. And I went to see it, and I had begged my parents for everything related to it. I got the book, the catalog for the exhibition. I got the audio tape. Yes, that dates me a bit. I listened to it on my Walkman regularly, and I listened to it over and over again. I remember bringing them to school and talking about it and showing it to anybody who would listen because I was so into it. And this book is actually still in my library today, my home library. And it stands out because most of my books, I have to say, are in awfully good condition. Some are pristine. I'm very careful with my belongings in general, but especially books. But this book really stands out because it's so beat up. And it's so beat up, you can tell from across the room. You don't have to pull it off the shelf even to take a look at it. You can see the spine is all worn. It's like the color of it has chipped off and stuff. And if you do pull that out, you'll see there's creases all over the covers. And I think maybe even a stain or two or something on it. Partially to do with my age at the time, of course, but also just because I used it so very much. And from then on, I wanted to be an Egyptologist. I especially loved learning about ancient Egyptian people. So in the case of that exhibition, it was about Ramses the Great, or Ramses II, who was a king, of course, or pharaoh, if you like. But it was really, I think, learning about his family that intrigued me the most during that time, because you hear a lot about pharaohs, kings, whatever, and you see these impressive statues. And I do remember the statue. They had this enormous statue that they brought to Boston for it that was so large, they actually couldn't bring it inside the museum. And so it was outside underneath like an awning or overhang that was in front of the museum. So that's definitely a memory that sticks out in my mind as well. But I remember when I was listening to the audio guide and reading the book that the part of the audio guide I repeated over and over again had to do with his family members. So things about Nefertari, his wife, and his daughter, Mariat Amun, that were talked about a lot in there. And I remember just, like I said, rewinding it over and over back when we had to rewind rather than just, double tapping or hitting 30 seconds back or something like that when we want to hear something again. And honestly, over the years, it's this connection to ancient people that's kept me going, kept me in love with ancient Egypt and wanting to know more. I'm fascinated by people in general, but especially ancient people, and trying to understand them, what they believed, what they thought, what motivated them, what were their actual practices, as well as, of course, those beliefs and motives behind them. And this is why I dreamed about becoming an Egyptologist. I also, of course, got everything else I could at the time on ancient Egypt, which wasn't a lot because this was pre-internet and I didn't live in the big city. So our access to bookstores that had much of anything was not much. I remember there was really nothing until Borders bookstore came along. And we never had one before until I was probably in my teens. And before that, unless I went to a museum with a special exhibit, really there wasn't much I could come across. Every now and then somebody would find a book and give it to me as a gift or something because they knew I loved ancient Egypt. But the access was limited. I did manage to get a stamp set on hieroglyphs, which I loved and I played with. I did try to learn some hieroglyphs. I didn't get too far, but I do remember going to the Museum of Fine Arts with a school group, my school group, and being so excited to tell everybody like the owl was an M, for example, because I mentioned my name is Melinda. So of course the signs I learned first were the ones in my name, and M in particular at the beginning. So I went through different things like that, but there wasn't a lot available in terms of how to study ancient Egypt unless you could get your hand on some books. And that was pretty much it. There weren't any local courses about it. Again, no internet. I don't think there were even necessarily any correspondence courses or anything at the time, at least not that I had heard about. And so while I did take many detours along the way, I eventually did go back to the idea of becoming an Egyptologist later on. Before that, I actually took some time off after high school and worked full-time before I decided to go back to university full-time. And while I was considering other careers, and I considered a lot of different things, everything from becoming an accountant to becoming a flight attendant, because I do love to travel. And I'm also very detail-oriented, so that's why the accounting was an idea. But I realized that this was really still what I wanted to do. I wanted to study people of the past. And I had kind of broadened my horizons later on in my teens and early 20s to be interested in other cultures as well and other periods of history, although I soon learned that ancient Egypt was still the top in my mind when I got a chance to study it. So I went back to college for full-time, or for those of you outside of the States, university. And after those first few years, I had taken some night classes actually while I was working full-time, but none of those had anything to do with my passions. They were just sort of general intro to literature and things related to administration and working in an office and things like that. So I ended up transferring to a full-time typical day university. And unfortunately, they didn't have anything about ancient Egypt. They did have a really strong ancient Near East department, which is what attracted me there. And I majored in that as well as in history, which was in a separate department. So I did a double major in those. And I really lucked out actually in my junior and senior years there. And I actually came in officially as a sophomore and went through more quickly because I had a few transfer credits and then I made up some extra courses along the way. And I'm glad I did because had I not, the timing would not have aligned for this, where the Museum of Fine Arts, which I mentioned before in Boston, had a special program at the time. I don't believe it exists anymore, but at the time they had a special program with 5 universities in the area, and mine was one of them. And as part of this program, they offered one course every spring semester, and it was only for students who were either juniors or seniors from those 5 universities, and only 2 per university. So my luck was that they were hosting a special exhibition the year I was a junior. And because they were hosting that special exhibition, which was on the Amarna period on Akhenaten, they decided that the art history course that they would offer in the spring would be also revolve around that topic. And I heard about it and luckily got in, even though there were 3 of us from my university actually who wanted to take the course. And luckily for us, the instructor, who is Rita Freed, who's still there at the MFA, and I still thank her very much and credit her as being my first professor in Egyptology. She luckily approved having all 3 of us, so none of us missed out. And it was an eye-opening experience for me because I'd loved ancient Egypt for so long, and I had studied other periods of history, other languages and stuff in depth in college, but I had never gotten a chance to study ancient Egypt. And I was still not sure what I wanted to do after university up until this point. But by the end of that semester, I knew I was absolutely sure I wanted to become an Egyptologist. I loved all my coursework. I mean, honestly, I'm a nerd, okay? I also would say I'm a geek. So I enjoyed pretty much all my courses. There's maybe one I maybe didn't care for so much. But overall, I really loved my coursework. Of course, I got tired of things near the end of the semester because we just literally get tired. There's a lot of work and you're trying to get a whole bunch done near the end. And so I would be relieved also when they ended, right? But this was the one course I felt like that even though it was a lot of work, I wrote the longest term paper I had ever written up till that point for that course. It was a course that I actually did not have any relief of it ending. I wanted to just keep going. And this affirmed for me that this was absolutely the area for me. So I decided I would apply for graduate school the following year in my senior year. And I also got lucky that, total coincidence, but the MFA also offered an ancient Egypt themed course in my senior year. And I also managed to get them to accept me to take that, even though I had already taken the one the previous year, because they knew me already and they knew I was applying to graduate school in programs like they had come from. In that case, I had Denise Doxey as my instructor, who also I thank very much for that introduction that she gave me in that year, in my senior year. But it was an amazing experience both times, and it really just set me on the path to actually pursuing this passion. And like I said, it's because it was really honestly back then the only way. There was no other option for studying this other than if you lived in certain places, maybe you might have had a lot of public lectures you could go to and things, but where I lived, there really wasn't any of that. So I applied to a number of programs and I was accepted to one of the main ones I was looking at and given a good offer. And I went there. I was so excited. My dream was coming true. And now I will say it was definitely rough at times, but I did stick it out through that, even as many around me actually didn't and fell away over time. And I also really felt, honestly, incredibly out of my element there. I loved, at least initially, eventually, I kind of felt like I found my people. There were a lot of wonderful people in my cohort, many of whom I'm still really good friends with. So it was definitely nothing to do with them or anything wrong with the people there. But I did feel really out of my element because I came from a family background where I would say, my immediate family, definitely very intelligent people and stuff, but we really came from a mix of what you could call either working class or poor background. And so while my parents had gone to college, they were the only ones and the first ones in their family. And so my understanding of kind of how that world worked was still pretty limited, even though I had had that opportunity to also go to university myself for undergraduate. But and some of the other people in my cohort were actually absolutely in that same boat as well. It's not like everybody was different or anything like that. But overall, being in that environment and at Ivy League University and a Ph.D. program and stuff definitely felt like very different than anything I'd experienced, different from like most of my family members that have experienced. And I kind of, felt a little lost at first and unsure of what I was doing and, would I make it through and all of that. But I did. And honestly, I loved it. And I loved being able to go to Egypt for the first time, which I did when I did archaeological field work with one of my professors and a bunch of the other students in my cohort. And that was such an amazing, amazing time. I had never had the opportunity to go to Egypt before then. It was just not something that was in the cards. We talked about it in my family, but it was, it was very expensive. It was difficult to do. You needed to get a tour and, it was just cost prohibitive. So I had never been able to go before, and being able to go there and see the monuments in person. And I know some of you may have never gone to Egypt before. Some of you have probably been before and can remember that first time that you actually went to like one of the temples there, say, for example, Karnak Temple in Luxor, which is just absolutely massive. And you see it in photos, but being there in person is just a whole nother experience, at least as an adult. I have to say, I'm going back more recently with my son and my husband. My son being much younger, as kids see so many flashy, impressive things these days, that he was just kind of like, not that impressive. Don't get me wrong, he loved Egypt. He had a great time, but he just didn't have that awestruck kind of thing that you do when you have a little more life experience and you see those massive columns and you realize how much work must have gone into making that. I think, when you're still like a kid or a tween or something like that, you don't really have that perspective yet. And so it's maybe not quite as impressive. But if you've been there, and probably in your teens or later, or certainly as an adult, you can, I'm sure, relate to that idea of how amazing it was. And getting to see things with some of my friends from graduate school, most of whom had been there before and I hadn't. So we didn't get to see a whole lot because we were mostly working. We worked 6 days a week and, in the middle of nowhere at Abydos or Abydos, depending on your pronunciation, where you are in the world. And so we got to see a lot of that archaeological site that we were on and right around there, but we only made a couple occasional very short trips to Luxor from there, and we had a little bit of time in Cairo at the beginning. So I definitely had this wonderful, deep introduction to Egypt and really getting to know some Egyptians because I was working with them there, where you wouldn't necessarily get that had I gone, for example, on one of those tours earlier on, which was an amazing experience. And I started to learn a little bit of Egyptian Arabic. I didn't have any yet when I arrived. I had none, which was definitely quite of an experience too, trying to learn what I could and get by and communicate. And that inspired me to come back. I came back on a fellowship and lived in Cairo for almost a year, a couple of years later, and definitely took those Egyptian Arabic classes at that time so I could get a good bit better at it. Still, I would not claim to be wonderful at it, but I wanted to learn enough so I could communicate at least on a decent level. And actually, then I got to see a lot more of the country. So if you've never been and you've thought about it, I absolutely would encourage you to go. If you've been before and you want to go back, don't wait too long. I waited way too long the last time, and I'm planning to try to get back sooner. Find some way to do it. I do. Now, not everybody. I'm not saying you have to, of course. I do definitely have students who don't want to go to Egypt or it's not possible for them and stuff. And then in that case, they can actually enjoy it wonderfully from museums at home. And nowadays from the internet, there's so much you can see just online, looking at museum websites and social media where people share wonderful photographs of temples and artifacts and museums and everything there. So you can also have a wonderful experience from home these days, which I think is so great. I mean, in my case, I don't know that I'm not sure if I would have done it differently or not looking back had I had those available, but maybe I would have. Maybe I wouldn't have even gone to graduate school if I'd had more available to me at the time. But I love that there's so many options now. And I mentioned how I lived in Cairo for a bit. I would say that was actually a really pivotal developmental moment for me. Cairo, I love Cairo, but it is so different than what I'm used to and where I'm from. And if you've been around here for a little while, you might know already, I've probably mentioned it a number of times, I'm a huge introvert. I'm not super outgoing. I am somebody who I'll love to talk like one-on-one, absolutely. So like the way I'm talking to you right now, love that. In large groups, not so much, not like a big party kind of person, not somebody who likes to be on stage necessarily or anything like that. And I like my quiet. So Cairo's very different than that. Cairo has a lot of sound, a lot of everything, a lot of lights, sound, and smells. I mean, just like it's a sensory overload for a lot of people, for me, certainly. So I love Cairo because I love Egypt and I love Egyptians and I love getting to know different parts of the area and seeing different stages of history represented in different ways. And it's an amazing place, but it definitely was very different. And because of that, and I went basically by myself. I had only been to Egypt on archaeological excavations before that. I'd been a couple of times on excavations. And so I always had other people with me who had more experience in Egypt than I did. When I went back and I went on a fellowship for doing my dissertation research, I had some assistance with some of the logistics through the organization that I got the fellowship from. But otherwise, I was basically on my own. I had to find an apartment and figure out how I paid bills there and things like that. These are things I'd done in the States. It's not like I'd never lived on my own or anything, but it's just very different there. So just figuring all of the logistics things out and how to deal with the bureaucracy when it came to work I was doing in the museums and also at archaeological sites when I was there was just a completely new experience and kind of terrifying, to be honest. For me at the time, I was really worried that I was going to get something wrong or it wasn't going to work out or they weren't going to let me see something or, something was going to go wrong. But it all worked out in the end, even though I definitely had some stressful moments. And I appreciate that year so, so much because not only was it a wonderful experience to be able to spend more time in Egypt and get to know Egypt better and get to know Egyptian people better and get to know the language, the modern language, somewhat. Like I said, still not going to claim to be great at it, but at least to know it somewhat and all of that. But it also just having done something that was so outside my comfort zone, really, I came back a changed person. I was completely different. I was much more willing to take risks. And I mean, small risks. I'm not like going to go base jumping or anything like that. But I was a very risk-averse person, always have been, and especially before that experience in particular, I was afraid of trying new things and doing things I thought I might not be good at and making a fool of myself and things like that. Those were all things that, not that I don't still have those fears sometimes, but those are all things that really changed for me really well after that experience. And so I'm so grateful that I got a chance to do that. And I wonder if you all have had some kind of experience like that in your life too, thinking back like where you had that thing that was really difficult, but you came out a better person and a more confident person on the other side, whether it was travel to a new place that was very different, living in a new city maybe, or just a new job that you had where you really felt out of your element. Or learning a new language. I think a lot of people can feel that way when learning a new language, like when they're trying to learn ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, for example. And it's such a wonderful gift to give yourself, though, when you go out of your comfort zone and try something new like that and really, push through it, even though it's difficult and you might feel like you're not getting it or something like that. Because I definitely had times where I felt like that when I was in Cairo, and I absolutely had times like that in grad school too. I didn't talk about it earlier on, but I absolutely had times in my courses, particularly in my Egyptian language courses, where I felt like I had no idea what was going on and I really wasn't getting it. But I stuck with it, and sure enough, over time and with practice and stuff, it all started to click. And it took many years, though, of practice. And that's one of the things I really love to do now is to help people be able to learn that in a way that was not as complex as what I went through at the time. That's one of my passions these days. And that sort of gets me to, why did I start Voices of Ancient Egypt in the first place? Like, how did this come about? Not just the podcasts, but everything, the YouTube channel. So after I finished graduate school, I moved across the country to a new city and started teaching at a university shortly thereafter. Now, being a huge introvert, like I mentioned, I had for many years thought I would work in a museum setting rather than teaching necessarily, because teaching always kind of scared me. And I didn't think I would want to be in that kind of environment or in anything very public facing. So it might surprise you that I ended up, working online, being on YouTube and things like that. And honestly, if you told me that 15 years ago, or even 10 years ago, I would have laughed in your face. I would have been like, there's no way I would ever do that. However, I did find out early on when I started out that I actually, before I left graduate school, I had figured out from some experience that I'd had that I really loved teaching, and I especially loved public outreach kinds of situations. So like I loved giving museum tours, which I was able to do many times as a graduate student. That was a wonderful experience, being able to do that at the museum at my university, as well as for a traveling exhibition about Tutankhamun that came through that you all might have seen about, it's more than 15 years back now. And I was able to give tours to school groups and also private parties and things like that during that time. And those were pivotal experiences for me as well, because I learned from that not only was I capable of doing things like that were very socially uncomfortable for me, but that I actually really loved doing it. And that's something I wanted to do more of. I wanted to reach more people. So after I had been in my new city and taught at a university, and I gave museum tours, held public talks sometimes and things for a number of years, and then I even started a blog at one point. I was, trying different ways to sort of do outreach. And but I found, I was still really limited on how many people I could reach and the number of things I could have a chance to teach and talk about. No matter how many courses I taught or talks I gave in my area, there's just so many people that I was going to reach. So I realized at one point I got the idea to start a YouTube channel back in 2016 so that I could reach more people. Now, I wasn't really sure what I was going to do on this YouTube channel or where it was going to go or any of that, but I just sort of daydreamed about it for a while. It took an entire year before I actually recorded any videos and got it started. And then I did start it in 2017 as when I finally launched it. I had a toddler at the time. I was juggling that along with teaching at the university and home life. And I had a toddler who had actually, when I started it, no childcare at all. And shortly thereafter, for several years, only a few hours of childcare twice a week. So I was definitely juggling a lot. And so when I started out, I decided that the topics I would focus on were ones that I was teaching in my university classroom and topics that I thought would be useful for my students there. And that really helped also to keep me on a timeline because I needed to have them done in time to assign them to my students. And that's how the YouTube channel got started. Over time, I met more and more people, virtually that is, who were following me from my YouTube channel and talked to them about their interests and their love of ancient Egypt and, what kind of frustrations they'd run into and problems. And I learned from that really most of them, what they really, really wanted help with and wanted to learn more about was hieroglyphs. And that's what set me on the course to eventually creating the programs that I have today that are there to help you learn hieroglyphs and in a much less painful way than I went through in graduate school. And so I have two programs, Scribal School and Master Scribes. I'll talk about those in future episodes. We don't have to get into the details of those now. But I wanted to bring up the topic because I know it is one that's on the mind of many of you out there. I've heard from lots of you that this is sort of the missing piece for you about ancient Egypt, that you've read a bunch of books and or read, websites, watched videos, maybe even taken some courses before. And oftentimes learning hieroglyphs is that sort of last piece in the puzzle that's just been hard to find. You can't find something that's going to fit right into that slot for you. So that's absolutely something we will be talking about on this podcast, as well as you can check out my YouTube videos The channel name is also Voices of Ancient Egypt, and also my social media accounts on Instagram and Facebook. I have a number of things about hieroglyphs on those locations too. So that'll definitely be a future topic on this podcast. We'll be talking about hieroglyphs and other aspects of ancient Egypt and ancient Egyptians, what their lives were like, what their beliefs were, various ancient texts, and their actual ancient voices, which is why I named my whole business and all of my names on the different platforms, Voices of Ancient Egypt, because that's what I really want to feature everywhere, which is the ancient Egyptians' voices, their own voices. I started this largely because not only did I want to reach more people, but I also saw that there was this great gap in what was available online. So online and even in books too, that I found that there's a lot of like very, very beginner material, right, about ancient Egypt, a lot of stuff about Tutankhamun, a lot of basics of, here's the timeline of ancient Egypt, or here's a little bit about this topic kind of thing. And a lot of like on the web, initially at that time at least, it's a little different now, but there were all these websites and they oftentimes were just copies of each other. So there really weren't even that many different things about there. It was just like the same intro things all over the place. And then the other things that were out there were the really advanced things that were actually created just for specialists who have PhDs like me. So it was like academic articles and or other resources that were aimed towards people who read academic articles and books. And it's the same thing with books. There's like some very intro books, the kind of stuff you'll find, oftentimes in a museum, and which I have plenty of too, and I love as well. And then the other books and articles available were all things that were really just made for specialists, and you had to know the special language of that, the jargon essentially, and what the background was here, because all of those publications and websites and stuff assumed that you already knew all of these things and what these different terms meant and things like that. So I felt like there was this huge gap, absolutely massive gap between the beginner material and then everything else, which was like not even what I'd call like beyond advanced, like way, way up there. Like honestly, even if you're getting a master's, you probably have trouble with it. It's like, really high level stuff. So, and really it's excruciatingly detailed that most people don't want to get into, right? So this was my aim, was to kind of fill this gap and make ancient Egypt available. And there were so many sources out there, some that were very good, though intro, and then there are, of course, many out there that are not so good and oftentimes are very misleading. And so that's why I wanted to focus on the voices of ancient Egypt, what we actually know from ancient Egypt, both in their own words from texts, but also from other things they've left behind, like archaeological remains, for example, and buildings and art and all of that, but actual things from the ancient Egyptians rather than a lot of these things that you see spun up in various places for various agendas and so forth. So that is what I absolutely love to bring to you here on this podcast, and I can't wait to see you in the next episode.